Hello, I thought I'd show my face for this one. If you can stand my grim visage. 8-bit first-person shooters, was that a thing? Well, yes it is, as it turns out. Might not be the place you expect to find them, but there they are, and that's what this video is all about. An 8-bit first-person shooter shootout, if you will. Not a definitive list, but a brief run-through of some of the more prominent titles on some of the better-known systems. So let's dive right in with MIDI Maze on the Atari 8-bit. Not released in 1989, this here is a prototype of a cancelled game that never made it into stores, though it does seem to be pretty close to completion. A port of the original Atari ST MIDI Maze from 1987, probably the first game that we can really, indisputably, unambiguously call a first-person shooter, though that might be an argument that I won't win in the comments. That aside, it is a groundbreaking title that made use of the ST's MIDI port for network deathmatch fun. This port to the ST's 8-bit sibling is the oldest game on this list, and given its age, well, it's not bad, but a little bit limited. Little in the way of single player content, there's no campaign or anything like that. This is focused almost entirely on multiplayer, with up to 16 competitors possible, though you can set up matches against bots. Now, just scooting around the maze, things do look very smooth indeed, but I'm afraid it does start to fall apart when it gets busy. I can't really speak of its performance with actual human players, but with a field full of bots, the FPS of this FPS does drop quite a lot, but I suspect the sheer novelty of network play would have carried this game quite far were it ever to see a wide release. Why was it cancelled? Well, who knows? The internet remains silent on that fact. I suppose it might have seemed like a bit too much of a gamble for Atari at the time, it still being an untested formula, a pure multiplayer game that required what was probably a quite fiddly setup to work. That, coupled with the declining market of the Atari 8-bit line, probably sealed its fate. As it is though, this remains just really a footnote in video game history, though it may well have worked out differently if Atari had had a bit more foresight. Up next, another unfinished game, a fairly common theme as it turns out in this video. On the C64, it's Mood. A game that I've spoken about before, and not without good cause, because this is, well, it's remarkable if nothing else. Emerging from the demo scene and causing a bit of a stir with those still following the C64 on its initial release in 1996, this is a project that pushes the brown blitz to its screaming limit. Still not complete, it does seem to have been abandoned by its creators, but this latest version from 2006 is pretty playable and implements lots of features. As you can probably tell, well, sacrifices have been made to make this game run, but thankfully frame rate isn't one of them. Yes, okay, it's Doom constructed out of Duplo bricks, but those frames keep on coming, giant as the pixels may be, making this, well, not a faithful port, but one that does have a bit of the Doom magic about it. With multiple weapons and some expansive environments, this is not far from being a bit of a gem, if only someone would finish it. Who would have thought that Nigel, as I'm now calling the C64, would have had it in him? Surely though we can go no lower, there's no way we could have Doom on an even lesser machine, can we? Well, hold the bus and prepare to be, well, slightly dazzled, because it's Doom on the VIC-20. What could possibly be the result of a very odd deal with the devil, Coda Creeper has managed to do the impossible and cram a very spirited port of Doom onto Nigel Sr. Yes, you wouldn't believe it if you hadn't seen it with your own eyes. It does require a whole 35 kilobytes of RAM to run, the VIC expanded to its limits, but even so, still a very modest platform to try and cram all this into. And this most certainly is a port of Doom, or at least a brave attempt at one, not just a game that's sort of like it as these things so often are. Trying to shove in as it does as many features of the original as possible, including a selection of familiar weapons and enemies, and even some recreations of the original maps. Heck, even the music is a rendition of the original tunes. Now, whilst this plays about 10 times better than you could ever imagine a VIC-20 port of Doom would do, well, it's still not really that wonderful an experience, would you believe? With dozens of pixels at least and what must be, well, several frames per second, it is a little bit indistinct and a touch lurid too, like viewing Doom through the eye of a needle on a thermal imaging camera. For a system that seemed to be pushed to the very edge by Pac-Man, this though is certainly an impressive breakthrough, whether it be the work of dark satanic forces or just plain old clever coding. The only way from here though has got to be up, but well, not that far, because I think it's now time to have a poke around in Spectrum Land, where more first person shooters that is really sensible have washed up on its blocky shores. Yes, we're spoilt for choice here, we can be a bit choosy. We could take a look at Digital Reality's Doom from 1996, like mood it's unfinished but playable and well quite nicely done too. We also might take in Alone Coder's Wolfenstein from 2004. This one apparently fully complete, as even a level editor. Colour out the window, but still a notable effort. Once again, well, it's quite nicely done. For me though, given the luxury of choice, the best the Spectrum has to offer in this weirdly well represented genre is the dark. Indeed, a slick production by Specky standards, complete with its slightly terrifying voice-acted intro. A nice touch, actually. Not the best voice acting I've ever heard in a video game, but well, it's not the worst either. Originally released in 1996 with a slightly tickled up reissue in 2016, this is a pleasantly playable game. Running just fine on a naked and unadorned 48K machine, it's definitely got the technical chops, but with a good dose of actually quite enjoyable action baked in. Not quite as ambitious as those ID soft ports, but maybe the better for it. Yes, it doesn't have the attention-grabbing big-name whiz-bang going on, but well, it's much more attuned to the Specky's skill set, and seems to be more about being a fun game rather than a pure programming skill showcase. There's a lot to like here, definitely inspired by the likes of Quake and Hexen, but by itself a fully original and complete title that's well polished. Some cleverly thought out levels, some great looking and thankfully easy to spot monsters, running on a game engine that certainly pushes the system hard, whilst still keeping the action pretty snappy. Sort of difficult, I did cheat just a little to get off the first level, but trapped with this in the Specky shed for an afternoon, well, you could probably get good at it with a bit of work. We could spend even more time in Spectrum Land. A lot of coders seem to have been pulled in by the allure of the little machine that couldn't, probably shouldn't, but somehow still did. I think though it's time to move on and maybe say hello to the sickly green but always welcoming world of the Game Boy. A familiar face this may be, the sequel to that great originator MIDI maze, but now under the slightly catchier title of Faceball 2000. The only game on this rundown that actually made it as far as a commercial buy it in the shop's release, and well, it does show, having a bit more of a professional gloss to the package. Now, despite what Wikipedia will tell you, this game can't really support 16-player multiplayer as is often reported, but is limited to the 4 players offered by the standard DMG 07 4-player thingy. This feature was planned, but as it turns out, not by daisy-chaining 4-player adapters, but by using its own custom gizmo that, well, never made it to market, making it, in practical terms, impossible to have so many players. That slight disappointment aside, this is, well, not the best game on the Game Boy, but still a diverting moment. The frame rate isn't amazing and neither is the draw distance, but still manages to lumber along at a reasonably playable pace. Quick enough, I dare say, to enjoy some stripped down multiplayer, and quick enough to enjoy its fairly large single player campaign mode too. A very nicely thought out series of levels await the lone player here, a primitive but still very recognisable first person shooter experience, featuring many of the game elements that later became the standard in this genre. Undoubtedly this is a great technical achievement considering the specs of the lowly Game Boy, but it's also pretty groundbreaking in game design too, popping up before Wolfenstein and Doom made it onto the scene and anticipating so much of what made those games popular. This game's level of accomplishment does tend to bring its shortcomings into sharp focus though. You expect a bit of jank with obvious homebrew projects, but here the game's flaws seem to be a bit more jarring when everything else is done so well. Overall though, it's not killed by its quirks and remains a nice package that probably deserves to be better known than it currently seems to be. Well, that may not be every game I could have mentioned, but I think it's enough to be going on with for now. I'm sure you'll remind me what I've missed in the comments below. And well, this is a shootout after all. I'm going to have to make some judgments now, aren't I? And well, you know what? They were all good, weren't they? They all deserve a prize for trying so hard. But well, that is a little bit of a cop-out. So to make it easier, I'm going to break things down a bit. Starting with the most technically impressive, a tough call, but I think it has to be Doom on the VIC-20. Of course it wasn't built for this kind of thing, none of these systems were, but as the oldest and in many respects most primitive machine here, well, seeing it run Doom, limited as it is, does seem like some kind of sorcery. The C64's mood definitely follows close behind though, not high resolution by any measure, but it really is very smooth and responsive to play. A bit more power than the old VIC, but well, not a lot more actually. The CPU was even a tiny bit slower as I recall, so still a huge achievement to see this work so well. When it comes to actual gameplay, as in what is a fun game to play, well, Faceball 2000 takes this one. The best all-round experience I would say, maybe not a surprise given that this was such a big budget release compared to anything else here. Ahead of its time undoubtedly, it seems to have predicted the pattern that so many of these games follow to this day. Yes, it wasn't Doom that perfected the mix of single player campaign and multiplayer deathmatches, but this little game from a couple of years earlier. Second in the gameplay stakes is The Dark, a surprisingly well executed shooter. No multiplayer, but the single player game is more than enough to make this a pretty notable and underappreciated release. Amongst all the releases that have cropped up in the Specky's afterlife, those homebrew titles, well, this is one of the absolute best. It could have been a huge hit if it had appeared a few years earlier, I'm sure. And that leaves us with Midi Maze, maybe the biggest disappointment on this list. Not terrible by any measure, it is quite a faithful recreation of the ST original, but it is a bit marred by its poor performance and lack of content. Get a bunch of people together in a network match and I'm sure it would have provided a fair amount of thrills. Maybe not quite up to the standard of the ST, but a respectable low spec approximation of it. But considering just how well this system did in the world of 3D, and there were some really great titles in that vein on this system, well, it's not as good as you might hope. One that was superseded by later titles that had the benefit of coming afterwards and building on the formula that this helped to lay down. Well, there it is, machines being made to do things they weren't meant to do, and for me at least that is always entertaining. That is all I've got for you for now. I hope you enjoyed watching this. I hope seeing my face wasn't too much of a shock. Maybe I'll do it again sometime, but for now, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.